Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in the Harvard Classics Lectures. This is lecture number 51. We'll be talking about Emerson's New England Reformers is the term. This is a speech, actually, an address that was given March the 3rd, 1844. So we're still in that year of 1844 that's so significant for so many of these essays we've been talking about. Now, hey, before we get into this speech essay, this address, we want to make sure that we remind you, if you haven't been following these lectures, hit learnstrong.net, go down that left-hand side, find the folder that says Harvard Classics, and at least watch lecture 35, the introduction to Emerson. There I will say what I will say now in brief, and that is we're looking at Emerson from three different perspectives. Emerson as teacher, as person, and the biography of Emerson, that's such an important part of our study. Here, for example, we'll make a comment about the fact he was so famous for his speech giving. We'll then, secondly, always think of Emerson as philosopher, as idealist, sometimes referred to as transcendentalist, although it's a term he didn't always relish. And then finally, we'll look at Emerson as artist, creator. Here, we're not looking so much at what he says, but how he says it at level 2B as we comment on it in our reading theory. Our learning theory in 303, just to remind, asks of us that we're always trying to connect new information to old information. In other words, we're looking for stuff that we can actually use, that makes some kind of meaning for us, and that's significant in our study, obviously, here as well. We will address this reading from three perspectives, our three levels of reading. We'll answer three questions. Level 1, what does the text say? Here we're just summarizing. Level 2, what does the text mean? Here we subdivide. 2A, themes, messages. 2B, that's the rhetorical stuff we were talking about. Not what Emerson says, but how Emerson says it. And then finally, at level 3, we'll answer the question, how can I relate in any meaningful way to this information? First, at 3A, we relate to other texts and to the world at large. And then finally, at 3B, most importantly, we relate to ourselves. I'm going to challenge you in this essay to hear some of the things that Emerson has to say about reform and the ways in which you're going to find maybe yourself challenged to think about, can we make the world a better place? Is that even possible? And what is the point of trying to reform the world? Now for some quick background information. Emerson was a very gifted speaker. He was raised to be a preacher in the pulpit. He left the pulpit, as we talk about in lecture 35, but he remained forever a great speaker. A part of the Lyceum circuit, he would travel. Back in the day, people would go and listen to other people speak, and this was a huge part of early American history and thought. And of course, it's still with us today. You can't just be elected president. You have to give a speech upon being elected president, and of course, a speech that becomes really oftentimes quoted and studied, like the famous Kennedy inauguration speech that we've talked about. This is a lecture address that was read before the Society in Amory Hall, Sunday the 3rd of March, 1844. Now, this society was the American Anti-Slavery Society, so this is significant. He's speaking to a group of abolitionists, people who are against slavery, led by William Lloyd Garrison, a really important abolitionist. So that's important that we kind of understand that much of what he's saying is couched in the language of the abolitionists and the abolitionist movement. The importance of reform in American culture cannot be overstated. We are the culture that in many ways almost seems to have invented the self-help books that are so popular. I mean, all you got to do is just go into any bookstore and see how many self-help books there are there. Think about, for example, even within the Harvard Classics, Franklin's autobiography that we began our conversations with is, I mean, really fundamentally a kind of self-help manual, ways to improve yourself, to reform yourself. Now, where does this come from? Historians have asked this question. Why is it that Americans are so driven by this idea of reform? There's a lot of answers to this question. Many have placed it in our Augustinian, Calvinist, Puritan background. Wesley's Methodism is more popular in the United States than even in England. Why? Because it preaches a certain idea of self-improvement, of self-aggrandizement, of making oneself better. And this is foundational to appreciating the American idea that Emerson is going to play into. Now, in this essay, what is at the heart of it? Let's say it out loud now. Emerson will say, before you can reform the world, before you can reform a society, before you can reform a group, you must begin with personal, individual reform. Now, this will sound very much like Plato's Republic, as we've talked about it. You can obviously find my lectures on Plato's Republic, where before he's ready to talk about justice in the individual, he wants to talk about justice in the ideal group. But he will make the final argument that it's symbiotic. You have to have just individuals before you can have a just society. Emerson will say as much. Now let's go ahead and number our text, the 34 paragraphs. I wish, as I have said in all of these, that I could read all of these, especially because this is an address and therefore it deserves to be read in its entirety. I just don't have the time. So we're going to have to move rather quickly here now, beginning with paragraph number 1, and he will begin by making an observation that America is a reform-centered land. We are all interested in reform. And he begins right away. He says, what a fertility of projects for the salvation of the world. The idea of we're always trying to improve. Now this is ironic that he begins by saying, everyone wants to improve everything. It is a little bit of his iconoclasm coming through. Emerson seems to have always been a little bit skeptical of movements in general and the ways in which people can kind of get caught up in these movements. Especially he will make fun of the back to nature movement, although let's make a point that in 1844 he does give his pal Thoreau that land next to Walden Pond where Thoreau goes to live for quite some time. By paragraph number 2, he'll begin to share his distrust for movements. He says it, with this den of opinion and debate, there was a keener scrutiny of institutions of domestic life than any we had known. There was sincere protesting against existing evils. There were changes of employment dictated by conscience. No doubt there was plentiful vaporing and cases of backsliding might occur. But in each of these movements emerged a good result, a tendency to the adoption of simpler methods, sounding very much like Emerson in his Walden, simplify, simplify, and an assertion of the sufficiency of the private man. In other words, one good thing came out of all these movements for reform, he says, and that is being reminded of the importance of always trying to make things better. By paragraph number 3, we'll have a contrast, he will say, between the mechanical and the spiritual methods. The mechanical related to the group at large, and the spiritual related to the individual particularly. By paragraph number 4, he's ready to make his observations. In politics, for example, it is easy to see the progress of dissent. The country is full of rebellion. The country is full of kings. Hands off. Let there be no control and no interference in the administration of the affairs of this kingdom of me. We're already thinking as well, of course, about the significance of what's happening in the abolitionist movement already, and culminating, of course, in the American Civil War. Hence, he says, the growth of the doctrine of the party of free trade and the willingness to try that experiment in the face of what appear incontestable facts. I confess the motto of the Globe newspaper so attractive to me that I can seldom find much appetite to read what is below it in its columns. Quote, the world is governed too much. The idea, again, is that he ends the paragraph with the very term, non-resistance. In other words, this debate is, should you fight to make the world a better place, and especially your country, or should you just let it alone? He mentions in paragraph 5 the issues of trade reform. He says, I find nothing healthful or exalting in the smooth conventions of society. I do not like the close air of saloons. I began to suspect myself to be a prisoner, though treated with all this courtesy and luxury. I pay a destructive tax in my conformity. Well, we're back, of course, to his ideas from self-reliance. He who would be a man, he says in that essay, must be a nonconformist, and this will be a central tenet to his views of reform. In other words, note the dialectic or the tension that's already being presented here. On the one hand, we believe the world should be made a better place. On the other hand, he's opposed to many times movements where people just kind of behave and act in uniform instead of in individual convictions. By paragraph number 6, he's ready to talk about the whole notion of educational reform. And in the process, he says some very compelling things. Now, we've said this already. Emerson's ideas on education and educational reform had a prodigious influence on one John Dewey, who ultimately will have a very important influence on American educational thought, especially this notion of pragmatic education. Listen to how Emerson says it. The same insatiable criticism may be traced in the efforts for the reform of education. The popular education has been taxed with a want of a lacking of truth and nature. It was complained that an education to things was not given. We are students of words. We're shut up in schools and colleges and recitation rooms for 10 or 15 years and come out at last with a bag of wind, a memory of words, and do not know a thing. This is a harsh critique. Some of you will say, sounds very much like the schools that we are attending now. We cannot use our hands or our legs or our eyes or our arms. We do not know an edible root in the woods. We cannot tell our course by the stars, nor the hour of day by the sun. It's well if we can swim and skate. We're afraid of a horse, of a cow, of a dog, of a snake, of a spider. The Roman rule was to teach a boy nothing that he could not learn standing. The Old English rule was all summer in the fields and all winter in the study. And it seems as if a man should learn to plant or to fish or to hunt, that he might secure his subsistence at all events and not be painful to his friends and fellow men. The lessons of science should be experimental also. The sight of the planet through a telescope is worth all the course on astronomy. We think of Whitman's When I Heard the Learned Astronomer. The shock of the electric spark in the oboe outvalues all the theories. The tastes of the nitrous oxide, the firing of an artificial volcano are better than volumes of chemistry. In other words, let's put it in our notes this way. Emerson is one of the first proponents of this idea that education has to have some real life value, and if it doesn't, it's a waste of time. Now, by paragraph number 7, he's going to take this one step further and begin to talk about the silliness of classical education, especially the learning of dead languages like Latin and Greek. And by paragraph 8, he's ready to lay it on hard and fast. But he says, is not this absurd that the whole liberal talent of this country should be directed in its best years on studies which lead to nothing, the learning of Latin and Greek? What was the consequence? Some intelligent person said or thought, is that Greek and Latin some spell to conjure with and not words of reason? If the physician, the lawyer, the divine never use it to come at their ends, I need never learn it to come at mine. In other words, he makes the observation, learning a lot of useless information is, well, useless. What is the point? In the end, he makes the observation that there was a whole group of students who never learned their Greek and Latin, and ultimately they were able to be just as productive citizens. What is the point? In other words, education has to give us something useful, or it's a waste of our time. By paragraph 9, he will say that we need short methods, like Occam's razor, although he doesn't mention Occam's razor. That idea that if you can explain something in 3 steps, and I can explain something in 2 steps, and we both can explain the process, my explanation is better than yours because it's shorter. That is a very Emersonian idea as well. The Americans' love of the shortcut, of the pragmatic, right? That is to say, the notion that James will later invent of pragmatism, and we've talked at length about that in other lectures. By paragraph number 10, he says it this way, many a reformer perishes in his removal of rubbish, and that makes the offensiveness of this class. They are partial, they're not equal to the work they pretend. They lose their way in the assault on the kingdom of darkness. They expend all their energy on some accidental evil and lose their sanity and power of benefit. It's of little moment that 1 or 2 of 20 errors of our social system be corrected, but of much that the man be in his senses. In other words, as you go about the whole approach of reform, moral reform, personal reform, don't lose your sense, don't lose your bearing, don't lose your way. By paragraph number 11, he's saying it this way, the criticism and attack on institutions which we have witnessed has made one thing plain, that society gains nothing, while a man, not himself renovated, it's an important word, renovated, attempts to renovate things around him. He's become tediously good in some particular, but negligent or narrow in the rest, and hypocrisy and vanity are often the disgusting result. In other words, he says, before you go out trying to change the world, you better make sure that you are an authentic self yourself. We'll use that language of Maslow, right? By paragraph number 12, he's ready to begin to talk about the quest. What is it? Total regeneration of the self. We think of Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey and that tranquil restoration. The power of love to reform is total, he says in paragraph 12. In paragraph 13, he says, reforming virtue can't be piecemeal. The street, he says, is as false as the church. In other words, no matter where you're trying to change some small part of society, there's always larger parts of society which are even more unjust. And therefore, by paragraph 14, he says, a just and heroic soul finds itself the law of one's own mind. And by paragraph 15, he talks about the problems with association. A committee of broken individuals is just a broken society. This idea that we can put a bunch of people together who are themselves not very well constructed spiritually, morally, intellectually, and yet somehow believe that they can figure out how to solve a problem, he says, I see this as a ludicrous suggestion. In the end, he says the union and paragraph in paragraph 17, he says we must have first self-reliant individuals before we have a group of individuals or concert. He says it this way. He says, yes, excellent, but remember that no society can ever be so large as one man. He, in his friendship, in his natural and momentary associations, doubles or multiplies himself, but in the hour in which he mortgages himself to 2 or 10 or 20, he dwarfs himself below the stature of one. Now, this is an interesting idea. It seems to suggest that Emerson is opposed to the notion that you should find some cause greater than yourself. Emerson would say about that, begin with the greatest cause, which is self-reform, and then find causes with other reformed selves to cohabitate with, to associate with, to commune with, and then together you can begin the process of changing the world. By paragraph 18, he talks about that this union must be inward. That is to say, in paragraph 17, he says it this way, thus, concert was the specific in all cases, but concert is neither better nor worse, neither more nor less potent than individual force. All the men in the world cannot make a statue walk and speak, cannot make a drop of blood or a blade of grass any more than one man can. But let there be one man, let there be truth in 2 men, in 10 men, then is concert for the first time possible, because the force which moves the world is a new quality and can never be furnished by adding whatever quantities of a different kind. What is the use of the concert of the false and the disunited? There can be no concert in 2 where there is no concert in 1. By paragraph 18, he's making this observation about a need for awakening. I do not wonder, he says, at the interest these projects inspire. The world is awakening to the idea of union, and these experiments show what he is thinking of. And then he continues by saying, each man, if he attempts to join himself to others, is on all sides cramped and diminished of his proportion. And the stricter the union, the smaller and more pitiful he is. But leave him alone to recognize in every hour and place the secret soul. He will go up and down doing the works of a true member, and to the astonishment of all, the work will be done with concert. Though no man spoke, government will be atomine without any governor. The union must be ideal in actual individualism. In paragraph 19, he introduces his faith in human nature as inherently good. This is foundational to understanding everything that Emerson writes. He believes that humans are inherently good. Of course, by paragraph 20, there's the counter response. Well, how do you account for all the bad things that happen in the world? Of course, the problem of skepticism is clear and present. He says it can lead to a secret melancholy. Here's how he says it. In alluding just now to our system of education, I spoke of the deadness of its details. But it's open to graver criticism than the palsy of its members. It's a system of despair. The disease with which the human mind now labors is want of faith. Men do not believe in a power of education. We do not think we can speak to divine sentiments in man, and we do not try. We renounce all high aims. We believe that the defects of so many perverse and so many frivolous people who make up society are organic, and society is a hospital of incurables who are going to be driven only by, he will say it, fear in paragraph 20. He calls it secret melancholy. And ultimately, he makes the argument by paragraph 21 that even the educated elite, the scholar, has proved a bad example, not worthy of emulation. Why? Because all of his learning didn't lead to any peace. I'm reminded of what Horace Mann says often when I will talk with educators and teachers. I'll remind them that Horace Mann is attributed to have made this statement. He says, those who dare to teach must never cease to learn. This, for Emerson, will be central. In other words, we constantly have to be improving ourselves if we're going to join together to try to improve the world. By paragraph 22, he says it this way: when the literary class betray a destitution of faith, it's not strange that society should be disheartened and sensualized by unbelief. What remedy? Life must be lived on a higher plane. We must go to a higher platform to which we are always invited to ascend, where the whole aspects of things change. I resist the skepticism of our education and of our educated men. I do not believe that the differences of opinion and character in men are organic. I do not recognize, beside the class of the good and the wise, a permanent class of skeptics, or a class of conservatives, or malignants, or materialists. I do not believe in two classes. This idea, he says, continuing, unwillingly the soul is deprived of truth. This idea that when you only are, when you're only able to take a look at the ways in which people misbehave, you miss the entire point. He will even give a great example of this. He says that it's kind of like, think about Plato's cave allegory, right? So those people are sitting in that cave. They think those shadows on the wall are real. Go back to my lectures on Book 7 of Republic. But the point here is that when people misbehave and they do bad things, it's not because they're bad, it's because they don't understand. They don't get it. To quote Christ on the cross, forgive them. Not because they're evil, nasty, wretched sinners, but they know not what they do. They're ignorant. And therefore, they should be more than anything pitied. By paragraph 23, he says it. We love genius. Why? Because it leads us to some expectation of hope. There's something for us to aspire to. The silent joy, he says, which leads to excellence. By paragraph 24, he says it this way. We are all children of genius, the children of virtue, and feel their inspirations in our happier hours. Is not every man sometimes a radical in politics?